A train sits on the tracks at a small border station in the early hours of a November morning. The platform is quiet, the air is cold, and the sky is the color of old iron. On board, a man in a military coat stares out at a country that is no longer his. He is 51 years old. 3 days ago, he commanded armies. He signed orders that moved millions of men. Ministers trembled when he raised his voice. Now he is waiting for Dutch border officials to decide whether they will let him in at all. He has no appointment. He sent no advance notice. He simply arrived aboard his Imperial train with nowhere else to go. The crates come later, the furniture, the silver, the oil paintings, the motor cars, all of it loaded into 59 freight cars and shipped across the border into exile. But on this particular morning, there is just the man and the train and the question of what happens next when an empire ends not with a siege or a battle, but with a railway timetable and a border crossing in the fog. This is not a story that ended in November 1918. It is a story that was still being argued in German courtrooms more than a century later. It involves a deposed emperor who spent 20 years chopping firewood in a Dutch garden, a grandson who worked on Henry Ford's assembly line, a crown prince who gambled the dynasty's future on Adolf Hitler and lost everything, and a legal dispute over paintings and silver and coffee spoons that was not finally settled until 2025. It is the story of a family that refused for 100 years to accept that it had lost. And it is the story of how that refusal finally destroyed the very thing they were fighting to recover. To understand how it ended, you have to understand how it began. Not in the chaos of November 1918, but in the long decades before it, when the Hohenzollern name was the most powerful name in Central Europe, and the men who bore it had no reason to imagine it would ever be anything else. The Hohenzollerns had ruled Brandenburg and Prussia since the 15th century. That is 500 years of unbroken dynastic power, 500 years of the same family sitting on the same throne, expanding the same territory, fighting the same wars, building the same palaces. By the 19th century, they had accumulated not just a kingdom, but an empire. In 1871, after Prussia crushed France in a war that shocked Europe with its speed and totality, Otto von Bismarck engineered the proclamation of a unified German empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The Hohenzollern King of Prussia became the German Kaiser. The family that had once governed a landlocked northern duchy now governed an empire of 60 million people and the most powerful army on the continent. Wilhelm II inherited that empire in 1888. He was 29 years old, impatient, vain, and absolutely convinced of his own importance. He dismissed Bismarck within 2 years of taking the throne, announcing that the ship of state would now sail under his personal command. For nearly 30 years it did, careening through diplomatic crises, colonial adventures, naval expansion, and finally into the war that would destroy everything. By the summer of 1914, the accumulated tensions of European great power politics ignited, and the German Empire was at the center of the explosion. By the autumn of 1918, it was over. 4 years of industrialized slaughter had killed millions, bankrupted governments, and destroyed the political order of a continent. The empires of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire all collapsed within years of one another, their dynasties scattered like leaves in a November wind. In Germany, the collapse was sudden and almost total. Sailors mutinied at the naval base in Kiel at the end of October 1918. The mutiny spread. Workers' and soldiers' councils formed across German cities, inspired in part by what the Bolsheviks had done in Russia the year before. The streets filled with people who had survived 4 years of war and were not prepared to fight another day for an emperor they had not chosen and a cause they no longer believed in. By the second week of November, the situation at the front had been hopeless for weeks, and what remained of the military leadership had told Wilhelm directly that the army would not march for him against his own people. The machinery of empire was seizing up, and the man at the top had nowhere to go. On the morning of 9th November 1918, before Wilhelm had even formally agreed to step down, the German Chancellor announced the abdication from Berlin. The Republic was proclaimed the same day, twice, by competing factions, the Social Democrats from a window of the Reich Chancellery and the radical Spartacists from the Berlin Palace. The empire that had been declared in Versailles in glory was unmade in Berlin in chaos, and the man it had revolved around was still on a train in Belgium, not yet across the border. He crossed on the morning of the 10th. The station was called Eisden, and it was about as far from the Hall of Mirrors as you could get while still using the same railway gauge. He arrived without announcement. Dutch officials scrambled to figure out what the protocol was for receiving a deposed head of state who turned up unannounced at a border crossing on a Tuesday morning. There was no protocol, because nothing quite like this had happened before. The last German emperor sat in his imperial train and waited while a handful of bureaucrats made telephone calls and sent telegrams and tried to locate someone with the authority to make the decision. Eventually, they let him in. They sent him to Amerongen, to the castle of Count Godard Bentinck, a Dutch nobleman who had never expected to become the host of a deposed emperor and who now had one living in his guest rooms. Wilhelm stayed at Amerongen for a year and a half, a man used to 50 palaces trying to fit himself into someone else's country house. He was not technically a prisoner. He could walk in the grounds, he could receive visitors, but he could not travel freely, could not make public political statements, and was under the constant awareness that the Allies wanted him handed over for trial. The Dutch government declined to surrender him. Queen Wilhelmina, who was 28 years old and had been on the throne for 20 years, decided that the right of asylum was not something to be traded away because the victors of a war demanded it. She refused, and she kept refusing, and the Allied appetite for the trial gradually faded. By 1920, nobody in London or Paris was seriously pushing for it anymore, and Wilhelm was left in his borrowed Dutch castle with nothing to do but wait. While he waited, 18 days after crossing the border, he put the abdication in writing. The document he signed on November 28, 1918, formally ended a dynastic line that had governed in northern Germany for 5 centuries. He signed away not just his own title, but those of his heirs, the right to the imperial throne, the right to the Prussian crown, the whole accumulated legitimacy of half a millennium of rule transferred away with a pen on paper in a Dutch country house. It was, as abdications go, one of the least dramatic moments in German history. There was no siege, there was no trial, there was no scaffold. A family that had governed since the 15th century stopped governing, and almost no blood was spilled to make it happen. The revolution had been astonishingly bloodless, by the standards of what revolutions usually do to kings. He was not the only monarch who lost his throne that month. Across Germany, more than 20 reigning princes signed away their titles in November 1918. The King of Bavaria, the King of Württemberg, the King of Saxony, the Grand Dukes and minor princes of a dozen smaller states, all of them gone within days of one another. The entire architectural framework of German monarchical government dismantled in a fortnight. What was remarkable was how gently it was done. None of them lost their lives. Most of them signed their abdications, retained large portions of their private wealth, and withdrew to their country estates, where they waited with varying degrees of patience for something to change. The revolution, in this respect, had been extraordinarily polite. It had removed the princes from their thrones and then, almost apologetically, allowed them to keep most of the furniture. The precise question of where private wealth ended and state property began was left for later. That question would not be settled quickly, and the arguments it generated would echo for a century. In May 1920, Wilhelm moved to Huisdoorn, a manor house near the Dutch town of Utrecht, which had been bought for him with funds drawn from his remaining assets. And this is when the freight cars came. 59 of them, each one loaded with the contents of the Berlin palaces. Oak furniture, porcelain, silver plate, oil paintings in heavy gilded frames, a writing desk that had witnessed the signing of orders that sent millions of men to war, a motor car, boxes and crates of the accumulated material of imperial life. It took days to unload. The Dutch village of Doorn, population a few thousand, suddenly had a deposed emperor for a neighbour, his gate watched by Dutch police, his garden screened by a high fence, his household still operating on something close to imperial routine. What Wilhelm built at Doorn was the smallest possible version of the world he had lost. Footmen still served at table. Guests were still received according to rank. The day was still organised around an imperial schedule. His second wife, Hermine, a German princess whom he married in 1922, the year after his first wife died, believed with absolute conviction that Germany would eventually tire of the Republic and summon the monarchy home. The household at Doorn treated the exile as a temporary inconvenience, a pause between chapters, not a final ending. The furniture from Berlin had been shipped, in their minds, for a reign that would resume. The terms of the exile were precise and confining. Wilhelm was required to remain close to the house. He was barred from making political statements, and his correspondence was monitored. In the absence of anything useful to do with his days, he picked up an axe. The supreme warlord of the German Empire, the man who had commanded the most powerful military machine in the world, now spent his afternoons chopping wood in the garden of a Dutch country house. He was very good at it. He kept count. By the time he was done, he had felled more than 10,000 trees and stacked the logs in rows with something close to military precision. Visitors who came to pay their respects to the fallen Kaiser found a stocky man in his 50s and then 60s working his way through a woodpile while Europe rearranged itself on the far side of the fence. The personal losses accumulated quickly. In 1920, his youngest son, Joachim, who had come home from the war to find himself without a role in a country that had abolished the court that would have given him one, took his own life at the age of 30. He had been a prince without a purpose, trained from birth for a world that no longer existed, and he could not find another. The following year, in 1921, the Empress Augusta Victoria, who had followed Wilhelm into exile and borne him 7 children, died at Doorn. She had lived just long enough to see the family settled in its Dutch refuge, and not long enough to see whether the restoration she believed in would come. The remarriage in 1922 to Hermine of Reuss gave the household a new political advocate. Hermine was energetic, ambitious, and convinced that the right combination of persistence and the right political moment would carry the family home. She lobbied, she networked, she wrote letters, she received visitors who shared her convictions. None of it moved the Republic. The Weimar government had no intention of inviting the Hohenzollerns back, and most of Germany's population had no particular desire to see them return. The men who had led the country into the war that had killed 2 million German soldiers and shattered the savings of millions more were not regarded with the nostalgia the exiled court expected. And then came the money fight. It had a simple enough beginning. When Wilhelm fled in November 1918, nobody had stopped to sort out which of his property was private and which belonged to the crown as a public institution. The Hohenzollerns, like most German dynasties, had accumulated wealth over centuries in ways that blurred the line between personal fortune and state asset. The palaces, the paintings, the hunting estates, the bank accounts, some of it was clearly private, some clearly belonged to the new republic or the German states, and a very large amount sat in the middle, claimed by both sides. Through the early 1920s, the various German states quietly negotiated with their former ruling houses over who kept what, trying to reach agreements without provoking too much public attention. Then, late in 1925, the Prussian settlement leaked. The terms that the Prussian state had agreed with the Hohenzollerns became public, and when ordinary Germans saw the figures, the palaces, the art, the cash, the package of wealth that the former ruling house was to receive, they were furious. The anger made a particular kind of sense. Germany in the mid-1920s was still staggering from the consequences of the war and the economic chaos that had followed it. The hyperinflation of 1923 had destroyed the savings of millions. People like Maximilian Bern, an elderly Berlin writer who had saved 100,000 marks over a lifetime of work, once enough for a comfortable retirement, drew the entire sum out of the bank in the autumn of 1923 and found it would buy exactly one thing: a single underground ticket. He rode the U-Bahn around Berlin one last time, went home, and died within weeks, too poor to buy food. He was not exceptional. His story was the common story of a generation of German savers, skilled workers, pensioners, civil servants, people who had done everything right and had everything wiped out. And now the men who had led Germany into the catastrophe that began the whole chain of disaster were to be compensated from the public purse. The idea struck millions of people as not just unfair, but obscene. The Hohenzollerns had the law on their side, which made the public anger more volatile rather than less. The Weimar Constitution protected private property and required compensation for anything taken for public use. The judges who heard these cases were mostly men trained under the empire, and they read the dynasty's claims generously. Several former ruling houses had already been to court and won substantial settlements. The legal road ran consistently toward the princes, and there was nothing the Republic could easily do about it through the courts. Which was why the left reached for a weapon the courts could not touch: a direct vote of the people. The communists launched a petition to strip the former royal houses of their property without any payment at all. The slogan was simple and direct: not a single penny for the princes. The Social Democrats hesitated, then joined them. It became a rare moment of unity on a German left that was more usually consumed with fighting itself, and it pulled in support well beyond the left: Catholic voters uncomfortable with the monarchists' claims, liberals, even some conservatives who thought the dynasties were overreaching. The petition cleared its threshold easily. By the summer of 1926, the question would be put to every adult voter in Germany. The campaign that followed was one of the most heated of the Weimar period. On one side, posters showed fat, bemedaled princes stuffing their pockets while ordinary families queued for bread. On the other, the churches reminded their congregations that taking property without compensation was, legally and morally, theft. President Hindenburg, the ancient field marshal who presided over the Republic with the air of a man who had been asked to manage a fire he fundamentally disapproved of, came out against the measure and lent the princes the considerable weight of his name. The dynasties spent heavily to defeat the proposal. They voted on the 20th of June, 1926. Close to 15.5 million Germans went to the polls, and almost 14.5 million of them voted to strip the princes of their property and pay them nothing. It was a crushing majority of those who showed up, nearly 94% of the voters who cast a ballot. But the measure would change the constitution, so it required not just a majority of votes cast, but the support of half the entire electorate. That threshold was set at approximately 20 million votes. Turnout stopped at 39%. The proposal failed, not because the people opposed it, but because not enough of them came out to vote. At dawn, reading the result, Wilhelm is reported to have observed that there were 14 million scoundrels in Germany. He meant the people who had voted to take his property. The remark revealed something about how he understood his situation. After years in exile, after the Republic had replaced everything he had built, after millions of his former subjects had suffered a catastrophe partly of his making, he still looked at 14.5 million people voting against him and saw not citizens with legitimate grievances, but scoundrels failing in their loyalty. The court at Durn had been living so completely in its own world that it had lost the ability to see the world outside the fence. The vote had failed on a technicality, but the arithmetic of sentiment was unmistakable. 14.5 million Germans had said in plain democratic terms what they thought of the former ruling house. They had not disappeared. They had not changed their minds. They were still out there, and the Republic that had failed to satisfy them was going to have to find a way to coexist with them. While the money argument ground on, not all of the Hohenzollerns were watching from Durn. One of them had left the whole dynastic project behind and gone looking for something more interesting. Louis Ferdinand was a grandson of the Kaiser. He was born in 1907, which meant he had been a prince of the Imperial house for 11 years before the empire ceased to exist. He grew up in a family whose entire identity was organized around a throne it no longer held and a restoration it could not stop expecting. He had no patience for it. By the time he finished his doctorate in political science in 1929, he had decided that the world beyond the family's horizon was more interesting than the vigil at dawn. He crossed the Atlantic. He went to America and did something that no Prussian prince in the long history of the house had been expected to do. He got a job. He took a position with the Ford Motor Company and spent time on the assembly line, learning how cars were built from the floor of the factory up. He was not there as a visiting dignitary. He was there as a worker, getting his hands dirty in the machinery of industrial production, meeting the men who actually made things, learning how the modern world generated its wealth. He became friends with Henry Ford himself, stayed at the industrialist's estate outside Detroit, and moved through American society with the ease of a man who had discovered that in a country where nobody cared who his great-grandfather had been, he could simply be himself. He flew aeroplanes. He mixed with film stars in Hollywood. He talked engineering and production and technology with the people who were building the 20th century. He liked the informality of it, the directness, the lack of ceremony, the sense that a person was judged by what he could do rather than what his family had been. He had grown up in a world where rank was everything, where the protocol of a royal household determined how every interaction was conducted, where the distance between a prince and an ordinary person was maintained as carefully as the distance between a general and a private. America had none of this, and he found it genuinely liberating. He said later that if Germany ever restored its monarchy, which he doubted, he would want it to be a modest affair. A bicycle monarchy, he called it, thinking of the kings of Scandinavia who rode through their own capitals without escorts, who shopped in ordinary shops, who were known to their subjects as people rather than symbols. It was about as far from his grandfather's court at dawn as a Hohenzollern had ever travelled, intellectually or temperamentally. He was not the heir, and he was not the one the family was counting on to carry the dynasty's hopes. But he would matter eventually, because one day, through the elimination of everyone ahead of him, he would inherit the headship of a house that had almost nothing left. The one the family was counting on was his father, the Crown Prince. And the Crown Prince had chosen a very different road. Crown Prince Wilhelm, the eldest son of the exiled Kaiser, had come home to Germany in 1923. He had given the Republican government his word that he would stay out of politics in exchange for permission to return. He broke the promise almost immediately. He settled into a palace at Potsdam, kept company with the nationalist right, cultivated relationships with veterans' organizations and the conservative establishment, and waited for the republic he despised to collapse. His father still entertained the idea that Germany might choose to restore the monarchy through some kind of democratic process, that the nation would eventually recognize its mistake, tire of the parliamentary chaos of Weimar, and invite the Hohenzollerns home with appropriate ceremony. The Crown Prince had no such patience. He had watched the Republic for years and concluded that it would not reform itself back into a monarchy. Someone would have to break it. And the man who broke it, in the Crown Prince's calculation, would be the one with the leverage to demand a crown in payment. By the early 1930s, he had found his candidate. Adolf Hitler was rising through the fractured politics of Weimar Germany, a figure from the violent political fringes who had tried an actual coup in 1923, served time in prison, and emerged more dangerous and more strategically minded than before. His National Socialist Party had been an irrelevance through most of the 1920s, winning less than 3% of the vote in 1928. Then the Great Depression hit Germany in 1929, and the political landscape cracked open. Unemployment exploded, the government's inability to manage the crisis became obvious, and voters began moving in vast numbers toward the parties that promised to destroy the system rather than manage it. By 1930, the Nazis were the second largest party in the Reichstag. By 1932, they were the largest. The Crown Prince watched this rise and drew what seemed to him like a straightforward conclusion. Hitler was obviously going to play a major role in whatever came next. The conservative establishment, the generals, the industrialists, the aristocrats, the old empire men, were convinced they could use him, could harness his popular support and his willingness to break the rules, and then control him once he had been handed power. They would be the real government. Hitler would be the front man, the rabble-rouser who had delivered the mob and could now be managed by serious men. The Crown Prince shared this conviction and added his own particular calculation to it. A regime that owed its rise in part to Hohenzollern's support might be persuaded to pay for that support with a restoration. He toyed in 1932 with running for president himself. A presidential campaign would have given him a national platform and demonstrated the family's continued relevance. His father, hearing of the idea from Dorn, forbade it, so he threw the family's support behind Hitler instead. A Hohenzollern prince openly backing the Nazi candidate was worth considerably more to the movement than an ordinary endorsement. It lent the whole enterprise a legitimacy it could not generate from within its own ranks. The old Germany, the Germany of discipline and authority and military tradition, was signaling that Hitler was acceptable. The signal was received. The moment that seemed to confirm the Crown Prince's gamble came on 21st March 1933. Hitler had been Chancellor for less than 2 months, and the regime was still establishing itself, still performing respectability for the conservative establishment it needed to manage before it was strong enough to discard it. The occasion was chosen with care. The garrison church at Potsdam, which was as close to a sacred site of Prussian tradition as anything in Germany. Frederick the Great was buried there. It was the spiritual home of everything the old empire had represented, and staging a ceremony there was a message about continuity, about the new regime wrapping itself in the authority of the past. The Crown Prince was given the place of honor, seated in the front row in full imperial uniform. Beside him was an empty chair, left symbolically for his father in exile, as if to say that the spirit of the old house presided even in its absence. President Hindenburg arrived in his field marshal's dress uniform, trailing the prestige of a man who had commanded Germany's armies and now stood as the living link between the empire and whatever was coming next. When Hitler entered the church and walked to the old man and bowed, the image that reached the watching world was almost too perfectly composed. The new Germany kneeling before the old, the revolutionary paying his respects to tradition, the outsider acknowledging the legitimacy of the establishment he was in the process of devouring. To the Crown Prince, sitting in that church in his uniform, it looked like the first step home. The conservative establishment around him, the officers, the aristocrats, the monarchists, the old empire men who had convinced themselves that Hitler could be used and then discarded, saw their own man honored at the center of the new order and concluded that they understood what was happening. They had it exactly backwards. Hitler had used them to climb into power, and now that he was there, he had no further need of them. He took the prestige the Hohenzollerns lent him at Potsdam and gave them nothing in return but the photographs. There would be no coronation. There was never going to be a coronation. The restoration had been bait, carefully dangled, swallowed whole. As the regime revealed itself over the following months, purging its own allies, consolidating absolute power, establishing the machinery of totalitarian control with terrifying speed, the men who had believed they could manage Hitler discovered that they had fundamentally misread the situation. The Crown Prince withdrew from politics, discredited and silent, the dream of restoration gone with his credibility. He had gambled the dynasty's political capital on a bet that Hitler would feel gratitude, and Hitler had demonstrated that he did not do gratitude. He did power. At dawn, the old Kaiser watched the new Germany with something approaching despair. He had no love for the Republic, but he had begun to understand that what had replaced it was far worse. He said with unusual directness for a man who had spent years hedging his public statements that Germany had ceased to live under the rule of law. He received news from Germany that the regime was brutalizing its opponents, and he was appalled. He had been many things: vain, impulsive, constitutionally incapable of listening to advice he disagreed with, but he was not, at the end, prepared to pretend that what the Nazis were doing was acceptable. His second wife, Hermine, who had been lobbying for restoration since the day she married him and who had cultivated relationships with various figures on the German right, was more accommodating. When German armies swept across the Netherlands in May 1940 and the exile found himself living under the control of the country he had abdicated, the household at Dawn had to make decisions about how to behave toward an occupying power that was, in a formal sense, his own country's government. When France fell that summer and the Nazi regime celebrated its greatest military triumph, Hermine pressed Wilhelm to send Hitler a telegram of congratulation. He did. It was a short document, formal in its language, the kind of message that powerful men exchange in moments of national victory. It was also, as it turned out, one of the things the Dutch never forgave. After the war, it would be used against the family's claims to their Dutch property, a few sentences that cost them more than they could have imagined when they were written. He did not live to see how the war ended. On June 4, 1941, at the age of 82, Wilhelm II died at Dawn. He had been in the Netherlands for 23 years. He had arrived as a refugee in the early hours of a grey November morning, and he died in the country house he had filled with the furniture of vanished palaces, still formally the head of a house that insisted it was between reigns rather than finished. Hitler wanted the body. He wanted a state funeral in Berlin, a ceremony at which the old empire and the new regime could be visually merged, where the last Kaiser's coffin could be used to wrap the Nazi state in the prestige of German military tradition. He was denied. Wilhelm's will had left explicit instructions. He was not to be returned to Germany until the monarchy was restored. Since the monarchy was not going to be restored, and since the man who might have restored it had instead abolished it in all but name, the condition could not be met. Wilhelm was buried at Dawn, in a mausoleum in the grounds of the estate. He is there still, a German emperor who died in exile and whose body has remained, more than 80 years later, in the Dutch village where he took refuge in 1918. His funeral was held as he had not wanted it to be held. He had asked explicitly that no Nazi emblems appear, no swastikas, no party insignia, no marks of the regime whose rise he had watched with growing horror. The wish was ignored. The swastika was there on the wreaths, on the armbands, draped over the ceremony like a claim of ownership. The regime that he had come to despise insisted on being present at his farewell, on marking him as part of its story, even when the man himself had tried to refuse the association. The Crown Prince outlived his father by a decade. He died in 1951, never restored and never prosecuted, his great gamble on Hitler long since exposed for what it had been. He had lived long enough to see the war he had helped make possible end in the most complete German defeat in history, to see the cities of the empire reduced to rubble, to see the country divided between occupying powers. He died quietly, his hopes buried so thoroughly that most people had stopped asking about them. When the Crown Prince died, the headship of the house passed to his son Louis, who was the same Louis Ferdinand who had spent his 20s working on Ford's assembly line in America. He inherited a title with almost nothing attached to it. The war had been catastrophic for what remained of the family's fortune. Their great estates, the hunting grounds, the agricultural land, the old family properties lay east of the Elbe, in the zone that Soviet forces had occupied at the end of the war. The new communist authorities in what became East Germany carried out a land reform that seized the estates of the old aristocracy and large landowners and redistributed the land to peasants and farm workers. They did it without compensation and without appeal. The Hohenzollerns, like the other great Junker families of the East, lost everything in the eastern zone. The dynasty that had filled 59 freight cars with the contents of its palaces in 1920 was, by the early 1950s, a family of significantly reduced means and a very famous name. For 40 years the matter sat there, unresolved and unresolvable. The lost properties were behind the Iron Curtain, in a country that had no interest in compensating the former ruling class of Germany for anything. West Germany had bigger problems, and could not have acted even if it had wanted to. The Hohenzollerns, like hundreds of aristocratic and land-owning families who had lost property in the East, simply had to accept that those particular estates were gone and were not coming back. Then the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, and everything changed. Germany reunified in October 1990, and the eastern properties that had been behind the Iron Curtain for 45 years were suddenly inside a single country again. Families that had lost land and buildings in the Soviet zone began asking whether they might now make claims. The German government had to figure out what the law said and what was politically sustainable. In 1994, the Parliament passed a compensation law for families whose property had been seized after the war. The Hohenzollerns, like others, were entitled to file a claim. The law came with a condition. Compensation was specifically barred to any family whose members had given substantial support to the Nazi regime. The clause had been written to prevent the worst collaborators from receiving a windfall from the democratic state they had helped to destroy. For most of the families making claims, it was irrelevant, a formality to be noted and passed. For the Hohenzollerns, it was the entire question. The man who had led the family through the crucial years of the early 1930s, who had made the political decisions that mattered most, was the same crown prince who had stood in the place of honor at the Day of Potsdam. The clause and the crown prince were inseparable. Everything the family was now claiming rested on the question of what he had done 60 years earlier. For decades, the claim moved slowly, intermittently through the German legal and administrative system. The family made various partial claims, negotiated in some areas, contested in others, and the whole matter remained complicated and unresolved. Then, around 2014, the head of the family, by now a man named Georg Friedrich, began pressing the claim with real force. Georg Friedrich was born in 1976. He was a great-great-grandson of Wilhelm II. He bore, by one of those accidents of genetics that history occasionally produces, a striking physical resemblance to the last Kaiser. He had the same build, the same bearing, the same quality of restrained intensity. He had grown up with the family's story in the same way that any child grows up with their family's past, as a given, a background fact, something to be understood and navigated rather than questioned. He had also, by the time he took charge of the family's affairs in his late 30s, developed a clear sense of what he thought the family was owed and a willingness to pursue it through the courts. What he was asking for was substantial. He wanted thousands of artworks returned to family ownership, paintings, sculptures, pieces of furniture, decorative objects that were currently held in state museums and the palaces around Potsdam that had been converted into public attractions. He wanted a say over the management of the palace collections that bore the Hohenzollern name. He claimed the right for the family to live in one of the historic royal residences near Potsdam, and he wanted financial compensation running into the millions of euros for what the family had lost. The objects he was claiming were not abstractions. They were real things, specific paintings, specific pieces of furniture, specific decorative objects that could be identified in museum inventories and traced back to the palaces that had been emptied into those 59 freight cars in 1920. The list ran from genuinely significant works of art, old master paintings, important historical artifacts, down to minor pieces, household objects, things that had been part of the daily life of the imperial household. Coffee spoons, tobacco boxes, the accumulated material of a family that had lived at a scale that made even its minor domestic objects museum-worthy. One of Georg Friedrich's requests attracted particular scorn. He wanted the right for the family to live at Cäcilienhof, the palace near Potsdam that had been built for the last crown prince and his wife. It was not just any palace. In the summer of 1945, Cäcilienhof had been the site of the Potsdam Conference, the meeting at which Truman, Stalin and Churchill, and then his successor Attlee, had gathered to decide the shape of post-war Europe. The conference that redrew borders, determined the fate of nations, and established the order that would define the Cold War had been held in the Crown Prince's palace. The idea that the family of the man who had helped bring Hitler to power should now receive the palace where the victorious Allies had agreed on how to deal with the consequences of Hitler's rule struck most observers as somewhere between audacious and absurd. The request was refused. To assess the central question, whether the Crown Prince had given the Nazis substantial support, the German government commissioned historians. It was the right approach, in principle. Let the evidence speak. Let scholars who understood the period weigh what the Crown Prince had actually done and what effect it had actually had. The historians went to the archives. What they found was not hard to interpret. The Crown Prince had publicly called for Germans to vote for Hitler in the presidential election of 1932. He had lent his name and his uniform to the Nazi cause at a time when the movement still needed respectability. He had attended the Day of Potsdam and sat in the place of honor in full imperial uniform at a ceremony explicitly designed to merge the old Germany and the new Nazi order. Most of the scholars who reviewed the evidence concluded that the Crown Prince had helped hand the regime the legitimacy it used to consolidate power. Whether any single act by any single individual could be said to have been decisive was always going to be arguable. History rarely reduces to one cause and one effect. But the weight of scholarly opinion ran clearly against the family's position. When the claim became properly public knowledge around 2019, the reaction was intense. Newspapers ran the history. Politicians asked how the descendants of a man who had backed Hitler could expect the German state to compensate them. The public mood, which the family had catastrophically misjudged, turned sharply against them. Georg Friedrich was asked in interviews to respond to the record, and his answers, defending or minimizing the Crown Prince's role, characterizing him as vain and politically marginal rather than genuinely influential, did not persuade the people who were listening. Their lawyers made the argument that the Crown Prince had been a peripheral figure, a man whose endorsements made noise but changed little, whose support for Hitler was motivated by vanity and wishful thinking rather than genuine ideological commitment. The legal standard was substantial support, and the lawyers argued that what the Crown Prince had done fell short of it. One of the historians the government had consulted acknowledged that the question could not be answered with certainty. But the preponderance of expert opinion did not support the family's case. The Crown Prince had done what the record said he had done. The consequences of what he had done were what the historians said they were. Georg Friedrich was asking, in the end, for the German public to fund a settlement for property lost after a war that his great-grandfather had helped make possible, while simultaneously defending the actions of the great-grandfather who had made it possible. The position was legally coherent but politically untenable. Faced with the combination of historical evidence, expert opinion, public fury, and a sustained press campaign, the family gradually understood that the fight was lost. In 2023, they withdrew their lawsuits. The legal battle that had been building for decades simply stopped. Quiet negotiations followed between the family and the relevant German cultural authorities, and in May 2025, Germany's culture minister announced that a final settlement had been reached. The dispute that had begun in 1918 when Wilhelm crossed into the Netherlands was over. The terms were a comprehensive defeat. The Hohenzollerns dropped almost all of their financial demands. Around 27,000 contested objects, the paintings, the furniture, the silver, the porcelain, the accumulated material of 5 centuries of Hohenzollern rule, would remain in public ownership, held not directly by the German state, but by a new charitable foundation established specifically to manage the collections. Anyone who buys a ticket to the relevant museums and palaces can walk in and see them. The family received 3 seats on the 9-member board of the new foundation, and no power to veto any decision the foundation makes. They kept a list of minor pieces, a handful of antique tobacco boxes among them, that were judged to be purely personal property with no public significance. The furniture from those 59 freight cars had finally stopped being argued over, 105 years after they crossed the border. What is most striking about the outcome, when you step back and look at the whole arc of the story, is where the dynasty's claim actually broke down. It did not break down in 1918, when Wilhelm lost the throne. The abdication, traumatic as it was, had not destroyed the legal basis for the family's property rights. It did not break down in 1945, when the Soviet land reforms swept away the eastern estates. That loss was brutal and total, but it was the kind of loss that post-war Germany eventually created mechanisms to address. It did not even break down in the 1926 referendum, when 14.5 million Germans voted to strip the princes of their property. That vote had failed on the mathematics of turnout. It broke down because of what happened in between. The Crown Prince's decision to back Hitler, the bet meant to carry the dynasty back to power on the shoulders of the new Germany, was the very thing that 90 years later made it legally impossible for the family to claim what they said they were owed. The 1994 Compensation Law's exclusion clause had been written for exactly this situation. The Crown Prince had handed the regime the respectability it needed at a critical moment, and the historical record of that act, carefully documented in archives and analysed by scholars, was what the lawyers on the other side used to defeat Georg Friedrich's claim in the 21st century. The dead prince had undone the living one. The most damaging witness against the family's case was their own great-grandfather, speaking through the historical record from a church in Potsdam in 1933. Had the Crown Prince done what he promised, stayed out of politics, kept his word to the Republic, resisted the temptation to back a strong man who he thought would make him useful again, the legal situation might have been entirely different. The family might well have won a substantial settlement in the courts. Instead, the gamble that was meant to restore everything cost them what they might otherwise have kept. You can see the outcome for yourself in Berlin today. The Prussian imperial crown, the crown of the Hohenzollerns, the crown of the house that governed the most powerful state in Central Europe for 5 centuries, sits in a glass case at Charlottenburg Palace. It is the property of the German public. Anyone can go in and look at it. It is not locked away. It is not in private hands. It is not in a foundation controlled by the family that once wore it. It is just there, in its case, in a room full of visitors who came to look at the objects of an empire that ended in a border crossing on a grey November morning in 1918. The family that wore it spent the next 107 years refusing to accept that the loss was final. They survived the chaos of the Weimar Republic, a referendum that nearly stripped them of everything, the catastrophic gamble of the Nazi years, the post-war seizures, the division of Germany, and a decade of increasingly contentious litigation. They tried every avenue available to them: the courts, the historical argument, the political relationship, the press campaign. At the end of all of it, the crown stayed with the public. The republic that took the Hohenzollerns' throne had its own short and violent life. It began with the abdication of November 1918 and ended on the day that Hindenburg, the old field marshal who had lent the princes his name in 1926, handed power to the man the Crown Prince had backed in 1932. To see how the republic that replaced the empire rose and fell, watch our next video on Weimar Germany. Please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments which chapter of this story you would like to explore next.